Good afternoon, everybody. It's Sean. I just want to welcome everyone to our 2:30 p.m. or 3:30 Friday afternoon reading. Thanks for joining. And we are we're going to finish up our book that we've been reading, Buried in Ice. We've got the final chapter, which is chapter 7. So, if you're able to watch live, that's awesome. If not, you can catch this on Sean Forschler Realtor Facebook page or on my YouTube channel, Sean Forschler YouTube, and it's under Children's Weekly Reading Corner. So, anyway, we were learning about the Northwest Passage, how the sailors were trying to go from Europe over to Asia through the north, and our Franklin expedition got stuck in ice, and they all died. So, and then they eventually found out what happened to them. So, anyway, fast forward. That was 1846. Now we're in 1984, which that's when this book was written. So back then, 1984 was the present. And these are the archaeologists that have gone in to research to find out what happened to this expedition. This expedition had everything. They had tons of money. They were well outfitted. So there's such a mystery of what happened. Like, how could it have gone so wrong? How could they all have died? So this is the final chapter. This is Franklin Sailors Live Again, Beachy Island, August 1984. It was like a scene from a horror movie, I thought to myself. In the gnawing Arctic cold, as the wind ripped around us and a massive black cloud rolled in over the site, our team hacked through 5 feet, 1.5 meters, of cement hard frozen earth. The air around the site was quiet, even solemn, as we sweated to expose the coffin. Remember, they're digging up the graves of the 3 sailors that died at the beginning of the expedition, like very early on. Not since the early years of Queen Victoria's reign had men dug at this site, and then it was to bury their shipmate John Torrington. Before we began our excavations, the frozen grave site had to be carefully staked out in a 1-meter grid pattern with string and metal stakes. The crisscrossing of the strings in the grid was like placing a huge sheet of graph paper over the area. Every detail of the grave was mapped, measured, sketched, and photographed so that when we finished, we could leave it exactly as it had been found. To assist in the grave's reconstruction, we numbered each of the stones that covered the burial mound with water-soluble ink. Over the months after we left the site, rain, sleet, and melting snow would eventually wash away these numbers. It took 2 long and difficult days to chop through the frozen rock using picks and shovels. We took turns breaking up the permafrost one small chunk at a time. Remember, the permafrost is the ground that's permanently frozen, and it's basically like rock. The broken pieces were then shoveled into a bucket and dumped on a large plastic sheet beside the grave. At last, research assistant Walt Cowell carefully swept aside the remaining layer of ice and gravel. "That's it. We've got it," he declared. Everyone was very quiet. We were all thinking about the huge responsibility of disturbing Torrington's cold sleep. I hunched beside Walt in the grave. First, blue wool fabric came into view, a coffin covering, and then a gleaming dark blue-green plaque cut into a heart shape. The white lettering read, "John Torrington died January 1st, 1846, aged 20 years." So he's only 20 years old. Remember, his friend Luke had cut out that can and inscribed that for his coffin. I ran my hand over the rough edges of the metal. Someone had carefully cut the heart from what may have been a tin can and painstakingly painted it. But we had to push on. I wanted the coffin to be exposed for as little time as possible to limit any damage that could be done by the weather and by thawing. Slowly we removed the mahogany coffin lid, only to reveal a solid block of ice that would take hours to defrost. Through the frozen bubbles and cracks in the ice, I could see something, but the more closely I looked, the blurrier it became. With warm water, we melted the ice encasing the body of John Torrington. As it thawed, I could first make out Torrington's striped shirt, every mother of pearl button in place. Then his perfectly preserved toes poked through the ice. Finally, I peeled away the last covering, the blue fabric that covered the sailor's face, and we all reeled back in surprise and awe. "He's there. He's right there," gasped Ann Carlson, one of the field assistants. Torrington's thin face, with his half-closed eyes, gazing through light brown lashes, had a peaceful expression. "It's as if he's just unconscious," I whispered. There, perfectly preserved in the Arctic permafrost, was a sailor from the Franklin expedition, dressed in his Victorian clothing. Wrapped around his chin and knotted tightly at the top of his head was a kerchief, and surrounding his head were many wood shavings. When the men of the HMS Terror were preparing Torrington for burial, they secured his body by tightly tying strips of cotton around his body, at his elbows, hands, ankles, and toes. Obviously, a great deal of care had been taken during the burial. Suddenly, I felt tremendous sadness for this young man's passing. In many ways, he looked as if he had just died, yet he had come from a world so very different than ours. And so a couple photographs. These are two photographs. It shows the team preparing the gravesite for excavation. So that's a photograph. And then we have a picture of the coffin that they discovered. After 48 hours of digging, we reached John Torrington's coffin. And there's a picture of the coffin, and you'll see his face. These are photographs. These were no longer paintings. So you can see how well preserved his face is. His eyes are even there. As leading stoker on the Terror, Torrington's job had been to shovel heavy loads of coal into the ship's engine. I expected his hands to be covered with calluses, but they looked delicate and smooth. "They're like you would have expected a pianist to be," I marveled. "He must have been too sick to work for a long time before he died." Even through his clothing, he looked extremely thin. There was silence around the excavation site. Each one of us, I think, was imagining what this man's final days must have been like. But why had he died? Only a medical autopsy would tell us. During the next 4 hours, we examined the body and collected bone, hair, and tissue samples for later analysis. After we were finished, we carefully laid Torrington's reclothed body back in the coffin. The lid was replaced. Water seeping naturally back into the grave would soon freeze and seal it again. Then the entire team gathered for a few moments of silence and prayer before assigning Torrington once again to the frozen depths, just as the crews of the Erebus and Terror would have done 138 years before. But while they paused for John Torrington on that bitter day in January 1846, none could have guessed what horror his death foretold. Their adventure was young, and the Northwest Passage, which had haunted men for over 300 years, beckoned somewhere across the icy waters to the west. Now, I faced an important decision. Our time on Beachy Island was almost up, and each hour seemed to bring winter closer. Winds were colder, and temperatures regularly dipped below freezing. Before long, the island would be covered in snow, and the tiny bay where Sir John Franklin's ships once lay at anchor would again fill with a crush of ice. Should we leave before the weather grew any worse, perhaps trapping us on the island for days, or should we continue with our work, this time unearthing the frozen coffin of John Hartnell? Something was bothering me about Hartnell's grave. It looked different from the other two, as if it had already been opened. I decided we'd have to investigate, even if it meant risking bad weather. The excavation of Hartnell's grave proved to be even more difficult than that of John Torrington. "Someone sure did a number on this grave," Walt said, pointing to a gaping hole in the coffin lid. It was clear that at some point following Hartnell's burial, someone had opened the coffin. Again, the body was perfectly preserved, but when the area around his face was thawed, we were shocked by what we saw. The sailor's lips had frozen into a snarl, and his partly exposed face framed in ice, looked like a frightening, shimmering mask, the face of a sailor who had suffered a terrible death. So a couple things I'll point out. So you can see some of the guys working. We'll look at a picture of John Hartnell's coffin, which is, you can definitely tell somebody hacked into it. And then there's a photograph here, and this is the month of July, and there is a winter snowstorm. Remember, they're in the Arctic. It's super cold. Even in the summer, it's cold. So these are some of the archaeologists. And then you can see Hartnell's coffin was hacked into at some point. And then down here, you'll see that's 24 hours of daylight. That's at night. But you can still see it's light, but it got real cold for these guys. The worsening weather at Beechy Island that summer brought an abrupt end to our work, and it was 2 years before I was able to return to the island to conduct autopsies on Hartnell and the third sailor, William Brain. But by this time I had learned who had opened Hartnell's grave. Searchers in 1852 who thought there might be a note inside or some indication of what had happened to Franklin and the rest of the crews, they had been disappointed. So it was one of the recovery missions that tried to open it and see if they could find some clues. As before, we found the digging to be extremely difficult. Unearthing Hartnell's coffin required 24 hours of continual labor by 4 men. While they worked, I went to explore a food tin dump left by Franklin's men in 1846. I knew that Sir John Franklin's expedition had been loaded full of food packed in tin cans, 8,000 of them. During most of the 19th century, tins were sealed shut with a mixture of lead and tin called solder. Could these tins have been a source of lead poisoning? I spent the day carefully documenting what was left of the cans. With the assistance of archaeologist Eric Damchar, I was able to examine closely the remains of about 150 of the cans. We collected 10 samples for later study and detailed analysis back in my laboratory in Edmonton. I returned to camp just as Hartnell's coffin was about to be opened. This time, the event was made even more moving by the presence of Brian Spenceley, our photographer. Brian was John Hartnell's great-great-nephew. When the coffin lid was open, he was able to gaze into the eyes of a relative who had been dead for 140 years. This time, as Hartnell's body slowly appeared through the melting ice, we could see that he wore a cap and that his head was resting on a small pillow. Soon we could see that his body, except his head, had been wrapped in a shroud much like a cotton sheet. Beneath the shroud, Hartnell, like Torrington, looked very thin. Whatever his illness had been, it had robbed him of will or ability to eat. On this trip, the research team included 2 X-ray experts. X-rays of Hartnell and Brain would provide additional information about their lives and deaths. The first films, however, were confusing. None of John Hartnell's internal organs appeared to be in the right place. We had to wait until Hartnell's clothing was removed to find out why. We soon discovered that the doctors on board the Erebus had performed an autopsy on him shortly after his death. From examining the features of that first autopsy, Dr. Roger Amy, who was overseeing our study of Hartnell, was also able to see those doctors had determined to be Hartnell's cause of death, tuberculosis. They would not likely have suspected any other cause. All right, now we got some photographs, quite a few. So you'll see the team here digging up another one of the graves, and you're going to see a photograph of John Hartnell, and he doesn't look nearly as peaceful as John Torrington did. And then you'll see William Brain. And these guys, it's a bit spooky, so just be prepared. So here's, that's John Hartnell's. And then these are the guys digging up the grave here. And then over here, you can see William Brain's remains. By the time I left Beechy Island that summer, I had collected samples of frozen tissue, hair, and bone from John Hartnell, as well as the third sailor, William Brain. The difficult, time-consuming work of examining and then carefully reburying each of these long-dead sailors had left us all mentally and physically exhausted. But I knew the real work was just beginning. It would now take several months of study and analysis before we knew whether the samples that I carried in a cooler would provide me with the final answers to the Franklin mystery. In the meantime, I knew that I had already had a rare and humbling privilege being able to gaze into the eyes of three men who had lived so long ago and who had clearly suffered so much. No one will ever know how these men spent their last days or what they had felt. But for those few brief hours during the Arctic summers of 1984 and 1986, they had lived again for me. In early 1987, the test results were at last ready. Lab tests on bone and tissue samples from Torrington, Hartnell, and Brain showed the same excessively high lead content as the Booth Point skeleton and the bones we had found in our 1982 investigation of the boat place. Remember, that's where they found some skeletons in a boat, and they found out that there were some knife marks on the bones showing that they were eaten by some of the other sailors in order to try to stay alive. And an analysis of the hair samples proved that these men had suffered from acute lead poisoning while they were on the Franklin expedition. I was struck by the horrifying truth. Lead had contributed to the declining health of the entire crews of the Erebus and Terror. Not only did the sailors suffer from loss of appetite, weakness, and other physical symptoms of lead poisoning, but the lead probably also affected their minds, making them behave strangely. Lead really affects your brain and ability to think. Many of them may have been unusually irritable, filled with unreal fears, incapable of clear thought, and unable to make important decisions. In some cases, like those of the three men buried on Beechy Island, the lead would prove fatal. Some of the autopsy results showed that Torrington, Hartnell, and Brain all suffered from tuberculosis and possibly died from pneumonia. But it was lead entering their bodies at high levels during the first months of the expedition that poisoned and weakened the three men, allowing the other disease to claim their lives. I then carefully studied the tin can fragments that I had collected at Beechy Island. In Franklin's time, this new invention had allowed food to be preserved indefinitely so that explorers could take with them supplies for long voyages. But the cans Franklin carried were seriously flawed. I could see that the metal edges and seams of the cans were sealed on the inside with large pieces of solder made of melted lead and tin. In some cases, there was so much solder that it had dripped and hardened like candle wax. While the can was full, lethal doses of lead from the solder would have dissolved into the food. So that's how they got all that lead. Our research also proved that the lead poisoning the sailors had would have come from the canned foods. The composition of the lead in the bodies and the solder was identical. How ironic it was, I thought, that the canned foods, which should have allowed the men to survive for years in the Arctic, were instead the cause of the early deaths of many sailors. It was not until the 1890s, long after the disaster, that the British government finally banned soldering on the inside of food tins. The men aboard Franklin's mighty expedition expected to succeed, in part because they carried the tools and knowledge of the latest technology of Queen Victoria's time. And yet they died as a result of one of those new inventions. Lead poisoning was certainly not the only cause of the Franklin disaster. Once the supply of food ran out, starvation and scurvy claimed the last survivors. But it was the lead hidden in the food supply that slowly poisoned them all, playing an important role in the poor health and judgment that doomed the famous expedition. When Sir John Franklin sailed from the River Thames in May 1845, an entire nation believed the honor of conquering the Northwest Passage was within his grasp. None could have guessed that inside the tins stored within the ship's hold there lurked a time bomb just as dangerous as the cruel Arctic winter. Exploring the frontiers of our world is one of the most exciting human quests, but it can also be the most dangerous, especially when exploration relies on untried technology. This fact was vividly demonstrated recently. In 1986, while the entire world watched in shock, One of the booster rockets of the Space Shuttle Challenger failed shortly after it left the ground, destroying the shuttle and killing all 7 people on board. Indeed, those explorers of space shared a bond with Sir John Franklin. Both used the most advanced technology of their time, and both suffered tragic losses as a result. In 1855, the year after the British government declared that Sir John Franklin and his brave crewmen had died in the service of Queen Victoria, one writer complained of the inhuman toll of Arctic research, arguing that their lives had been thrown away. But Franklin and those who joined his expedition understood many of the risks involved in Arctic exploration. It wasn't enough for them to speculate about the last unknown shores on Earth. Even though no sailor would actually use the dangerous Arctic passage as a route to the Far East, Franklin and his men wanted to chart those cold Arctic islands, to explore land never seen by Europeans, to be the first to find the Northwest Passage, which had been sought after for more than 300 years. No one would take a ship all the way through the Northwest Passage until Norway's Roald Amundsen conquered it in 1905. But Franklin's failure was, in one sense, a victory. For the searchers who followed his trail through the ice succeeded not only in opening up the great Canadian Arctic, but in challenging the last and most forbidding land on Earth. And that is it. And let me just show you a couple pictures. We've got, this is what the remains of one of the tin cans looks like. So it's all rusted out. And then here they're putting the grave, one of the graves, back as it was when they found it. And let's see, we got... And here's the team. This was the team back in the 1980s the whole team that did all this work and found out what had happened to the Franklin expedition. All right. So, an interesting story, very historical, very interesting, kind of sad, but nonetheless, I hope you enjoyed it, Buried in Ice, and we will be starting a new book, obviously next week, so I hope you will join me for that reading next week, and I hope you guys all have a great weekend, and I will see you here next Friday. Bye.